In the last lesson, we learned about the importance of selecting a sample in order to get information about a population. In this lesson, we're going to take a close look at samples, both good and bad. We'll talk about the bad samples first, and hopefully learn some techniques to avoid and some questions to ask whenever we read the results of a poll. Then we'll take a look at good samples and learn how to select samples that are representative of the population. Popular magazines and newspapers often contain surveys that ask their readers to answer questions about hot topics in the news. Do you think the responses the magazines receive are representative of the public opinion? Let's take a look at some examples. When Shaquille O'Neal first played for the Orlando Magic, the Orlando Sentinel published the results of a call-in poll. More than 90% of respondents thought the team should refuse to offer Shaq the salary he was demanding. Apparently, Shaq wasn't wanted in Orlando. He soon moved to Los Angeles Lakers. This type of sample that was taken for this poll is called a voluntary response sample. Voluntary response because anyone could participate, Lakers fans as well as Magic fans for that matter. Voluntary response samples, which are samples generated by voluntary response, overstate strong feelings, making this type of sample biased. In other words, this type of sample will overrepresent one portion of the population and horribly underrepresent all other parts of the population. Biased samples give us faulty information about the population that they're drawn from. Instead of a phone-in survey, suppose a reporter for the Orlando Sentinel stopped fans who left the basketball game early and asked their opinion of Shaq and his salary demands. This type of sampling is called a convenience sample. Notice that in this scenario, participants are not volunteering. The participants are contacted by the reporter. However, only those who are convenient to the reporter are selected. Like the voluntary response samples, convenience samples are often biased samples, since participants who are convenient at any given time may not represent the entire population. We see a second example in the Lafayette Journal and Courier. In June 1996, they reported the results of a write-in poll they conducted. So let's just practice what type of sample was taken for this poll. Hopefully you're saying a voluntary response sample. If you are, you're correct. Notice that we have to volunteer to write our answers in. So this would be a voluntary response sample. Here are the results of that sample. More than 80% of Journal and Courier readers who responded to an Express Yourself question last week don't believe President Clinton deserves a second term in the White House. Responding to a question published a week ago today, 41 people do not believe the Arkansas Democrat should be reelected. Only 10 people thought he deserved another 4 years. The question asked of readers, do you believe President Clinton deserves a second term? Well, there are many weaknesses in this poll. First of all, who is a big weakness. This, as I said before, is a voluntary response survey, so we know that this is going to be a biased sample, overrepresenting the views and feelings of the individuals who have strong feelings about Clinton, and totally ignoring the majority of the population, the rest of us, who didn't have really strong feelings about that particular president. How many is also a weakness here. Apparently, very few people responded. Remember, it said 80% of those who wrote in felt that President Clinton didn't deserve a second term. And in the next sentence, it said 41 people expressed the opinion that he should not be elected for a second term. Well, 80% of N, our sample size, is equal to 41. 41 divided by 0.8 gives us approximately 50. So they had a whopping 50 people express an opinion in this for this particular newspaper, and they're reporting it like it has some meaning. A good question to ask yourself whenever you read a poll is, what aren't they telling us? Notice here that the sample size was never disclosed, and when the sample size is not given, that should serve as a big red flag. Be wary of any of the conclusions you read from this poll. They most likely do not represent the entire population, or public opinion in this case. Example 3 is my very favorite. The Literary Digest was a popular magazine back in the 1920s and 1930s. The Digest ran a poll prior to each presidential election. which in 1936 predicted a 3-2 victory for Alf Landon over FDR. Now, anyone who knows the presidents of the U.S. knows that FDR stands for Franklin Delano Roosevelt, one of the most popular presidents ever. And who is this Alf Landon fellow? Well, obviously this poll was a bad one. The results of the poll were embarrassingly inaccurate. Well, what went wrong here? Well, the sampling frame, there are two things actually that doomed this poll right from the outset. First of all, the sampling frame was insufficient. The sampling frame consisted of the Literary Digest readers, people who had car registrations, and people who owned telephones. Now remember, the sampling frame are the actual individuals from the population that can be selected to be a part of the sample. So they left out a good number of people in the United States at that time. Not everybody read the Literary Digest. This is back right after the Depression, so obviously not many people owned cars, and not many people owned telephones. Telephones are rather new then too. So they're horribly biasing their sample toward the wealthy, most likely, those who could afford the magazine, those who could afford cars, those who could afford telephones. It was a voluntary response sample. There were 10 million ballots that were mailed out. Only 2.3 million ballots were returned, and you might think, wow, that's a huge sample, and it is a huge sample. This, though, was only a 23% response rate, and this is kind of the essence of what we need to see here when it comes to sampling. Don't be fooled. No matter how large bias samples are, they're still biased. So we could have 2.3 million responses to our poll, but if it's a biased sample because it's a voluntary response sample, it's going to give us misinformation about the population. And that was the case for Literary Digest. Shortly after that, they went out of business. I believe the American public lost faith in their reporting, and that was kind of the beginning of the end for them. So in summary, good samples of size n are randomly selected by chance in such a way that every set of n individuals in the population has the same chance of being selected. Good samples are unbiased. That is, they represent the population from which they were drawn. They represent every aspect of the population from which they were drawn. Bad samples, on the other hand, are biased. That is, they do not represent the population from which they were drawn. Instead, they systematically favor some part or parts of the population more than other parts in choosing the individuals that will be in the sample. So now that we have shown what can go wrong in sampling and the consequences, let's take a look at how we select a sample correctly, or how we select a good sample. In selecting a good sample, we allow chance to select who is going to be in our sample. How do we allow chance to do that? Well, there are several ways we can do that. In the exercises that follow, we will be using a random number generator to select a simple random sample, or what we call an SRS for short. The random number table that is included with this lesson, that can be found in the back of the textbook if you've chosen to purchase that optional textbook, can be used, and the random number table is what will be used on all of your tests. It will be provided at test time, so anytime we're doing some examples with the random number table, you want to pay attention. You're going to need it to do that in your homework and on your test. We can also use the random number generator that's on your TI-84 calculator. Most calculators have random number generators these days with the power of technology. Also, random number generators are on the computer. There are many random number generators available. One of the ones that I would suggest that's very easy to use is www.randomorganizer.org/form.htm. So now that we have these tools at our disposal, let's get started.